Embracing Design Constraints. I'm Keith Evans. I'm the lead designer at Red Storm Entertainment, working on The Division. Let's get going. So this picture here, this is how game development feels a lot of the time, right? You're working on a bunch of things simultaneously. You have no idea if they're going to come together into anything that's fun, or if you'll finish it on time. And you just have that moment of, oh my gosh, we're not going to make it, or you have to pull out, right? And what I want from game development is, for it to feel a little more like this. Like these people have their plan, they're crushing, evacuating that plane safely, just perfect. Kind of thinking of contingency plans and these ways to make sure our teams succeed is something I've kind of done throughout my career. And that's kind of the thesis statement of this talk, is just having plans and being able to build your designs in a way that you can achieve success. So we're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk about Division Year 1, just a brief history of kind of where the project was and where we started as we looked into Year 2. And then I'm going to tell some stories. I'm going to do a tale of two 1.8s. 1.8 was our big update in Year 2. We're going to look at two kind of different versions of what could have shipped and what did ship. I'm going to dive in a little bit into my personal design approach that I try to use on any project, not just applicable to the division. And then kind of pulling from that, we're going to dive into some best practices that I think can apply to a lot of games. So Division Year 1. Before we go too deep into that, just a little more information about myself. So I've been in the industry over 10 years, and I've worked in pretty much all the specializations of design. So doing technical design, games and systems design, doing some level design. And I just bring that up because that's kind of the way I think about designing a project, very holistically, not like too lasered in on one specific part of the process. Like I said, right now I'm the design lead at Red Storm Division, and I joined the project a few months before we launched. So there was already a few E3s under the division's belt. I was kind of already a fan of it before I joined the project. So it was pretty exciting. In general, I have way too many hobbies, mostly cooking, but in general, I love making games the most, so that's what I spend most of my time on. So, The Division. Hopefully, most of you guys may know about it, but at a high level, it's an online open-world RPG. So it shares a lot of the kind of fabric foundation of an MMO, but with a little more hardcore shooter twist, and kind of the nerdiness of a full Dungeons & Dragons style RPG. After I joined the project, we kind of launched right into this open beta and started kind of picking up steam, and once again we hit like this peak of excitement in the studio. We're starting to see, oh man, this might actually land, this might actually turn into a thing. We launched on March 8th, 2016 on all the platforms, and pretty quickly, we became the fastest selling new IP of all time. So this is all just to say that there was so much optimism in the studio. We were so just looking into Year 1 like, yeah, we've got this. Look, we sold all these copies. There's all these gamers. We have our Year 1 plan, and we're just going to go execute it. And of course, nothing ever really works out exactly how you have planned. So The Division is a huge game, and it has a lot of studios involved in it. So just some quick shout outs to the people who helped us make this game. Massive, they're the huge studio in Malmö, Sweden, and they kind of incepted the project, and they have a really talented workforce. And then they're supported by Red Storm here in North Carolina, and Reflections and Ubisoft in France and Newcastle, England. But then even past that, there's other studios supporting on things like QC and marketing and head office, kind of all around the world. It takes a lot of people. So when you have a kind of a huge project like this, you gather a ton of data. There's just so much number crunching going on in the background, and then PR people get a hold of it and they like to put it together into really pretty looking infographics, right? And this is the one we put out at the end of Year 2. And this stat here is probably the thing that Massive likes the most. 20 million players have played The Division, and that's twice the population of Sweden. So that's just, kind of points out that if we all banded together, we could probably take over Sweden. So we shipped the game, and we had a pretty ambitious Year 1 plan. We had a mixture of some free updates, And also, we were already selling a 3 expansion season pass, right? And all that stuff we were starting to churn on it. So the game comes out and we immediately launch into updates. So April, first update hits. The game gets a little bigger, there's end game missions. May, the next update hits. Now all of a sudden there's gear sets, the game's growing a little bit more. And then our first paid expansion dropped in June. So 3 months in a row, 3 big updates, the game's growing really quickly. Too quickly, that's probably the best way to look at it, right? We were jamming too much stuff in the game. And some of the foundation started to fall apart. It got a little rocky. The community was getting upset that there were these bugs we weren't fixing. So we kind of pumped the brakes and put out our next update a few months later, and it was all focused on quality of life things, fixing bugs, fixing network lag, and kind of revitalizing the loot game and the end game. So 1.4 came out in October, and then we immediately went back into just pumping out expansions. So we added a survival mode, which retrofitted the entire world with kind of an instant survival game. And then we added Last Stand that expanded the Dark Zone playable space by about half and added open world organized PvP. So what do we have? We're now at the end of year 1, and we're kind of looking at what we just did. And the game is now huge. And what I mean is there's a lot to do in the game. When we shipped, we were criticized pretty fairly for having a weak end game. And we'd done a lot of work to like flush it out. It was one of those games now where you could jump in and do a different thing every night, and we're feeling good about it. The game's also, in general, a lot more stable than it was before. We had kind of regained the footing that we had when we launched, and the community had responded really positively. And mostly, that meant they were still playing, right? So when we started working on these expansions that we're going to launch at the end of year 1, a lot of us didn't have a ton of experience with live games. We're thinking to ourselves, are players going to be around to play this content when it actually launches? But now it's all out. Players are pretty happy. They're engaging. Numbers are up, and we're kind of back on solid ground. But now they're saying, awesome, cool. What's in year 2? And this is where we all kind of looked around at each other and we realized we were going to have to step up considerably to deliver something much larger than our initial plans, right? Like, we already had a year 2 plan that we were feeling pretty confident about. We were going to do this update that was going to add kind of timed events throughout the game and revitalize old content. There was going to be a little bit of new gear. Like, it was already sizable, and we already knew it was going to be free. But now we had to do something much bigger. So the update timeline. So 1.6 launched. 1.6 was our last update of year 1, right? That was Last Stand with the Dark Zone expansion. And that launched on February 28th. So immediately after that, we started developing the 1.7 update concurrently with our codec partners. Like I said, there's a lot of people working on this game, and in year 2, it was a lot of that work was being done with Newcastle Reflection, in Newcastle, England, and us. So we were helping them, and they were helping us. And then we shipped 1.8, the big content expansion for year 2, on December 5th. So that kind of gives you some idea of the timeline we were working with, and also that big workforce from the map earlier on. Now it's a reduced workforce. I don't know if everyone knows this, but Division 2 is announced, so a lot of people were starting to work on that project already. So what we shipped was the Division Resistance, a free update, 1.8 at the end of the year. And this is kind of what that looks like.
Welcome to the largest ever free update of Tom Clancy's The Division. In this update, the Rikers, Cleaners, and LMB have all joined forces in a bid to wipe you out. 1.8 unlocks a huge new area, the West Side Pier. Explore this new map extension that includes Camp Clinton, a new operations base for all agents. Resistance is a new mode within the West Side Pier area. Work with your team against waves of enemies that become stronger and more numerous as you advance. Defeating these waves rewards you with resources, opening up new areas and setting up powerful defenses. Don't forget, cooperation is key if you want to succeed. As well as the resistance mode, we're adding skirmish. Pit your team in a 4x4, pure PvP deathmatch against rival rogue teams for high-end rewards. The first team to reach 20 kills wins the match. New challenges need new weapons. In 1.8, we've introduced exotic new guns to give you new options for your arsenal. 1.8 introduces new engagement rules in the Dark Zone. 1.8 also brings changes to Underground mode. We've added checkpoints, as well as hunter enemy types, to make the sessions more challenging.
So there you go. That was our launch trailer for 1.8. My favorite part of that trailer by far is that we specifically point out that we added checkpoints because the community was really wanting checkpoints. Not the sexiest feature, but it made a lot of people really happy. So this is kind of, the rundown of all the stuff. It's a lot of stuff packed into one update that we did in a relatively short amount of time with way fewer people than we had previously. So now I want to tell you kind of how that pitch, what ended up getting shipped, kind of how that evolved from the kind of initial inception and kind of what our initial pitch was, and then something a little more closer to what we actually shipped. So when we were first pitching this, it was pretty loose. It was just a whiteboard and a couple of us sitting around the room, and it was more of a wish list of items, right? And this wish list got locked in pretty early as like the pillars of this entire update. And so it was some big things like an open world expansion. We'd already done Dark Zone North, so we added 3 new zones to the Dark Zone, but that was for a very specific type of player. There's a lot of people that didn't want to go in the Dark Zone. It was kind of mean to them, and so we wanted to give the majority of players a new zone to explore. We knew we wanted to add a PvE horde mode because year 2 was going to be a lot about retention, right? You wanted something that was going to be highly replayable, that would be different each time, and it was also one of the core kind of experiences that you kind of expect to have in a looter shooter that our game was still lacking. We knew we wanted to add a very traditional PvP mode, right? Like that mode that's explained in the trailer is obviously just super basic team deathmatch, but that was the thing our game was missing. We had the Dark Zone, which was this very like, shades of gray, you never know who a good guy or bad guy is. And then we'd added Last Stand, which actually had way more in line with like MOBA style design with creeps and collecting currency and a lot of team tactics. We knew we wanted to expand the gear game because we're a looter shooter. We need people to still want to play the game. And we wanted to update existing mechanics, and we wanted to get retention hooks in there for every player, and all of a sudden this list is looking really big. There were definitely more things on there than that. Those were just the expensive ones. So what did that initial kind of list of bullet point desires turn into? Well, what it turned into is a pitch that you get when a lead designer and a creative director and an art director sit in a room without the input of their team and just think up something, that kind of is their ultimate version of the game, right? And we used that to pitch the first experience of 1.8. We called it Invasion. So you can see here, that red highlighted area, that's the new area of the map that we added. So in Invasion, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what it was, you would go into this new zone in the game, all the factions would have united and they would be fighting you together for the first time, but you wouldn't be alone. It would be a shared phase with 12 other players. Previously, all the open world stuff in our game had just been you and your group, and we wanted to get rid of that, make it that Dark Zone style experience, but for PvE players. And we didn't just want to make a horde mode, we wanted to create a horde campaign. We wanted to create these 3 horde arenas throughout the Westside Piers, and when you walked into the Westside Piers, you were kicking off like a lengthy gameplay experience where you would transfer between these different arenas, kind of conquering them one at a time. And then as you move back into the open world, there'd be other shade agents out there. And depending on how you guys banded together, there was a simulation running over the whole thing that would kind of raise and the kind of threat level of the zone. So there'd be these random missions popping off, and if all the agents didn't come together, things would get worse the next time you came out of Horde. And it would all culminate in a random arena that we would choose and be different each time from like a pool of arenas, and it would switch into endless Horde, and then you could push and see how good your build is. Needless to say, that was too big of a pitch to do in like 8 months. So, as we were already working on that, we started thinking, maybe this is too much. We want to do it, people are excited about it, the team's getting excited about it. We somehow convinced our producer that it was going to be cool, even though he's just shaking his head at me right now. But at one point he said it was cool. And we're already thinking to ourselves, okay, this is too much. So even though we hadn't formally written it down yet, we were starting to form these kind of like decreased scope design with a lot of the same elements. And we called this one Resistance. So in Resistance, it shares a lot of the same kind of building blocks. So we build our new Westside Piers open world zone, and when you went in it, the United factions would be there fighting you, and they wouldn't be scripted spawns like in the open world. We'd have a dynamic spawn system over the whole thing, so it kind of had that every time you enter, you know where the threats are coming from, and we wanted to create higher replayability than we've ever had in our open world space before. And then hidden in this zone, there would be 3 Horde arenas, but at each of those, they would create endless wave, rising difficulty Horde experiences. And you could choose which ones you wanted to do and kind of hit these thresholds by hitting wave milestones at the different arenas. So obviously, there's a lot of similarities there, right? And I think, hopefully that second one still sounds pretty cool because we actually shipped it and people seemed okay with it. And throughout development, that initial pitch, it kind of transformed into something smaller, but very, very similar with a lot of the same kind of core pillars being checked off. And I think, looking back on the development of 1.8, I'm very confident that the only way we succeeded was because the team was bought into the idea that we were going to be proactively de-scoping along the way to make sure we hit our goals. And there you go, that's kind of how it forked off. So now before I go much deeper, I want to talk a little bit about my personal design philosophy. So there's kind of this weird thing when you do talks like this where you start thinking very deeply about things that you typically just do instinctually, right? Like you're not normally giving a lot of thought to your process until you have to sit down and put words to it. And as I was thinking about this, what kind of popped in my head was the Myers-Briggs test. I don't know if any of you guys remember this, but you probably did it in freshman psychology or back in high school. And it's a type identification test. So basically there's 16 different personality profiles, and you answer all these multiple choice questions, and then it kind of starts slotting you into these different profiles, and they really kind of make up the way your brain works a little bit, and kind of gives context to the way you make decisions. So I'm an INFJ. So that means introverted. So this is going great right now. Intuitive, feeling, and judging. So at a high level, the INFJs are this kind of rare 1% of personality profiles that are deeply introverted, but because they're very goal-oriented, they kind of can sometimes appear extroverted and get out and make decisions in front of a team and kind of be very convicted. So another nice side effect of this is that I share my Myers-Briggs with by far the best sci-fi and fantasy characters. So you got Obi-Wan, Lupin from Harry Potter, he's the best without a doubt, and Galadriel. So this has nothing to do with the talk, but everyone should take their test and see who they line up with, because it's really fun. Don't do a history check, because you might be kind of upset with what you find. So what does that INFJ actually equate to, and why does it kind of I believe, guide the decisions I make. So I'm going to straight up read this because it's from Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge. INFJs are conscientious and value-driven. They seek meaning in relationships, ideas, and events with an eye towards better understanding themselves and others. Using their intuitive skills, they develop a clear and confident vision, which they then set out to execute, aiming to better the lives of others. And this is, I think, the important part. INFJs regard problems as opportunities to design and implement creative solutions. And this kind of spills into the other part of my personality, which is, at my core, I'm like a fixer. I have to make the people around me happy and keep everyone kind of as positive as possible at all times. Like, I want to solve problems for the people around me. And I think all those things have made it so that this is the way I want to make video games, right? I think, you know, throughout my career, there's been this series of attempts of trying to make games a little more dependably, right? To make sure we're going to end successfully as much as possible, and create these contingency plans. And you know, it's something that I've been doing anyway, and then on 1.8, because of the circumstances, because of how big the project was, because our small amount of time and people, it kind of put all these things to the test, and I think helped me form this list of best practices that we're going to go over now. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about embracing layered designs. We're going to talk about respecting that design's continuum. We're going to talk about de-scoping early. And then we're going to wrap up with some conclusion takeaway stuff. So, layered designs. It's kind of like this beautiful birthday cake that my wife actually made. You know, every layer is beautiful and different and adds the greater picture. So what I mean by this is, as you're thinking about your designs, you're not thinking about the end game first, right? You're thinking about creating platforms for your designs that can add up to that big picture. So this isn't something that you actually have to like put into your design docs, right? Like, we all write docs differently. We all have our own process, and you want to be fluid when you're writing your design docs. But it's something that you can have in the back of your head and you can share with your producer, and they'll be a little bit more confident in your ability to deliver something. So in that layer 1 design, right, what are the things that need to go in there? The base essentials to fulfill the design goals, right? So if we look back at 1.8 from a PvE context, what were those core design goals? It was an open world expansion, it was a PvE horde mode, some other stuff, but from a PvE standpoint, those were the big ticket items. And that layer 1 is a foundation for you to build all the rest of your design off of, right? Like, nothing in the deeper aspects of your design can exist if layer 1 wasn't there. And this is probably the most important piece of it, and the hardest piece of it, is that layer 1 version needs to be shippable, right? Throughout development, like, we all know how this goes, right? You have your big plan, and there's all these aspects of your game that you're building concurrently, and you know, maybe it's playtesting feedback, or your publisher steps in and gives you some direction. The priorities of the stuff you're working on shifts all the time, and inevitably, some piece of your design is going to have to not be given the priority you originally thought, right? Being able to scale back to this kind of level 1 design and be confident that if we ship that, we're still going to meet our goals, right? We're going to excel in these other areas, but we're still going to have this piece of the puzzle. Once again, it's just kind of ensuring your team's success. So of course, you're building more and more layers on top of that layer 1 design, and each layer is kind of adding the texture and the depth to your game. So looking at this in the context of 1.8, what was in that layer 1 design, right? Like, what would have we shipped if we literally had to cut everything down to the bare minimum to meet our goals? It would have been an open world expansion, right? We needed that. We would have built that zone. We knew that was a core pillar, and we had to fill it with something. And the most dependable thing we could fill it with were side missions. The game already had side missions. It was reusing old content. It would give players something to do. It would get them exploring around the zone, and it would check the box. It's not the thing we wanted to do, but it was a start. And then we would have added a horde mode, right? Like that was so key to saying, hey, we have a new mode in the game now, and come back and play it, and it's replayable, and it's challenging, and it pushes your build. But you can make a horde mode with a set number of scripted waves, right? We had all of our AI, we had a lot of gameplay ingredients. We didn't ship this, we shipped something way more complicated, but at its core, we could have created something totally scripted, and it would have served the function. Players, unless they played it multiple times, may not have even known. And layer 2 immediately starts adding a lot more depth, because we start building new tech on top of that foundation. So layer 2 adds a dynamic spawner. Previously in the division, everything had been completely hand scripted, and encounters were placed, and the players just knew, like, oh, when I round this corner, there's going to be that guy right there checking out that dead body or looting that car every time. They were very dependable. We still would have had our open world expansion, but there were some ways we wanted to blow it out, right? We wanted to add a new safe house. This was a big new part of the game, and the safe house was a social space where players could meet up and kind of launch their adventure for the night. We'd still have side missions, they'd still just be scripted side missions. But we'd take that dynamic spawner and we'd start integrating it into the rest of our design. So unlike the rest of the game that was kind of scripted, okay, now we have this new tech and it's layer 2, and so let's retrofit the entire open world space to be completely procedural, right? You enter the space and you never know where the AI, you never know where the AI are going to be, and it is going to up the replayability, right? It's going to add to that retention, which was like so key to making this thing a success. And we'd still have horde mode, but now we'd use our dynamic spawner to make endless dynamic waves, right? We'd have a system now that would allow us to not get in there and hand script every bit of content, and would allow us to make a lot more easier. So layer 3 expands that out even more, right? We still have the dynamic spawner, but the open world now has randomized side missions, right? This is the natural evolution of what we've done before. We had all of our building blocks, so how can we reuse those, kind of rework the core infrastructure of these so that they're able to be repeated and appear at random locations, and it's just a twist on our previous stuff we already built. But to players it would be a whole new thing. But it was going to be work, and so it's on layer 3. And for the horde mode, we would bring in a couple new things, right? We'd still have our endless dynamic waves, but we'd add on top of that scaling difficulty, right? This was going to be something we knew was going to be a lot of work, to get a system that felt good and not too punishing for players, that would allow them to push, to 40, 50 waves and actually still get a challenge, not just peak out the experience. And we bring in Shade Tech, which was something we'd done in Last Stand. It's basically just I kill an AI, I get a special currency, I can use it for this round, and we give you things throughout the environment to spend that currency on. So layer 4, this is actually what we shipped. This is from that layer 1 design, that really base experience. We built it up, and this is how far we got. There were many more layers where we wanted to go. We did not get that far. It would take multiple more layers to get to that invasion design. So we have our dynamic spawner, and in the open world, we'd have collectibles, right? We had a group of players who desperately wanted more story. The game shipped, had a lot of story out of the gate, and it hadn't kind of expanded that core narrative in a long, long time. In the same way there were people who only wanted new gear, there were other people who only wanted to know more of what was happening in the world. So we'd give them, 60 collectibles to go find, and audio logs, and things that made the world feel richer, and made that environment we built more, useful to more players. And for our horde mode, the big thing was we would add unique rewards. So we added a bunch of things. We added unique caches that were tied to you could only get them out of playing this Resistance Horde experience. We added things that you could spend your Shade Tech on that gave you rewards in the middle of a match. And it really drove the replayability of the mode, because people now wanted to replay it and get to high waves just to see if they could get a special drop. So you can kind of see here, just super high level, how much the design expanded out from that layer 1 design to layer 4. But, if push would have come to shove, if it would have been the worst case scenario, we would have been able to take a fraction of our team and deliver something that players would have been happy with. So another way to think about this and the kind of my gamer part of my brain, who's always trying to relate everything back to games always, is like a character creator, right? Like character creator, you have all these sliders, and no matter what, you're going to finish with a character. There's not a slider that says delete character, right? You're always going to finish with something. But depending on how you move your sliders around, the game or your character is going to change a lot. So this is definitely not the Division character creator, which mostly specializes in 28 different types of neck tattoos. It's pretty impressive. You know, a lot of individuality there. But it's more traditional character creator. So I'm calling it my game creator, right? And there's three main sliders that I'm messing with. I have time, I have people that can work on the project, and I have the overall budget. So, you know, that's going to go into actually paying the people, but it's also our marketing cost and how much outsourcing can we do, and all those things add to the scope of the project. So by default, you know, we're putting our sliders in the middle, right? We're shooting for success. We want it to be good, and this probably gets us pretty deep into our layers, right? But it's a realistic goal. And it kind of looks like this. It kind of makes like a beautiful cake. Like that's a pretty damn good looking cake, right? There's swirly bits and there's flowers, and I bet that cake is very delicious. But, you know, sometimes things happen and people get transferred off to other projects or leave the studio, or your publisher, you know, needs people to work on a different project, and, you know, those are unforeseen things. And with this approach, right, you're not cutting the thing altogether. You're de-scoping it down to something that's probably still pretty awesome. Like there's like some piping on that still and icing. Like someone still cared about that cake. It could get a lot worse. It could have no icing and just be a sheet cake from Kroger. So maybe you've just absolutely crushed it and the game's come together and you're feeling pretty good about it and your publisher sees what you're doing and they're like, you know what? Yeah, you lost your people, but you still have your money, so we don't need your game this quarter. It's fine. You can go further out. With this layered design approach, you can now scale back your design and start implementing those features that, you know, you planned for from the beginning. They're still there. And now you have something, you know, pretty awesome. There's strawberries on top. And occasionally, magically, you know, once in your entire career, something great will happen and you'll just be able to max out all the sliders. And you'll hit your, you know, super opulent 8-tiered wedding cake, right? And then we all win Game of the Year. So the next thing I want to talk about is de-scoping. And it's a little cheesy, but a saying we said a lot when we were making 1.8, you would hear people say it as they walked through the halls. They would say, chop chop. And it just meant somewhere, something had been slightly de-scoped, right? The producer even hung a sign above his desk. So we kind of embrace this, right? Like that kind of seems bad. Like I've been on projects where something gets cut or something gets de-scoped and it's completely demoralizing and soul crushing to the team because that thing you worked on forever is gone. We didn't feel that way because the thing wasn't gone, it just was changing, right? We weren't cutting entire parts of the game, we were de-scoping down to smaller layers. And so we kind of embraced it, right? And we leaned into it, and our success came from us doing this often and early. And that's kind of how we went from the invasion design to the resistance design. It didn't take very long for us to figure out, okay, invasion's not happening. We just had a production assessment and it's going to come out in 2 years. And you know, the tech team is already saying that 12-player phase, yeah, you guys are dreaming, we're not doing that right now. So we started some de-scoping early, right? But we didn't get to the resistance design, the actual shippable thing, for months, right? It was a series of de-scopes and cuts that kind of went along our trajectory. So you can kind of see what would that layer 6 design look like for invasion, right? There were multiple cuts that got us from invasion to resistance, but it was about 2 layers deep of the design. So 1.8 layer 6 had a 12-player shared zone, which was definitely a lot of work. But it also had this threat escalation simulation, and this thing was elaborately designed, like too elaborately designed is the best way to put it. So it was going to keep track of the AI population at all times. It was going to maintain this population between sessions because players could come in and out of sessions. It was going to have like decay built into it. It was basically like we were building SimCity on top of the Division. It was going to be kind of ridiculous. And you can see where we cut those, right? Layer 5, that was where we cut the 12-person shared phase. We knew early that that wasn't going to happen. So layer 6, cut the shared phase, now we're down to layer 5. But we still had that threat escalation system, and we planned on that thing for a while. We started building ways to our dynamic spawner to work with this system and fluctuate the environment a lot more. And to the player, it kind of still feels like there's something in there, because instead of going all in on a full simulation, we scaled back to some random occurrences and ambushes and decays on timers and just things to make it feel the way we wanted without doing the super sexy design that we all really want to make. So with descoping, the reason I'm kind of hitting this a lot is just because throughout my career, it's one of the things that people are the most resistant to because we're so married to the things we're working on and we want everyone to see how cool they're going to be. But in those moments, what are our options really, right? So we can delay, we can push the game to a different quarter. That's one of the options. You need more time to do the thing. But typically your publisher doesn't like that. If you're an independent game, you want to get that game out there to start earning revenue. There's all these things, right? That's not really an option most of the time. We can crunch, which is something Redstorm is super against on every level, and we don't do it whenever possible. And your team will hate you for it. You can descope, right? You can take kind of this moment into your own hands and set forth the plan, right? Go to the team confidently and say, okay, yeah, we're not doing that, we're scaling back, but we're still gonna crush it, it's totally fine, and you're owning your own destiny. And the really bad one is you can fail, because that's what happens when you don't deal with things like this. It's those games where you get so overburdened, so over-designed and scoped that you have to hit that deadline, the team's crunching like crazy, the goal still seems unrealistic, and everyone ships, and you're looking and going, oh man, I don't know if that was worth it, right? It's not a good feeling, and it's the feeling that I'm constantly trying to keep myself away from and keep my team away from, because I want everyone to finish the project feeling incredibly jazzed that we just completely crushed the update and the community's happy and we're happy. So you have your design, right? You have your design that's layered and still super deep and interesting, but scalable. And you've been diligently descoping along the way, and kind of the last piece of this puzzle is kind of respecting all those decisions you made, right? Respecting your design's continuum. So, what I mean is your game is similar from the beginning to the end, but there's these tiny differences that add up from layer 1 to layer whatever you can get to, right? And you'll start cutting along the way, and things like this can happen. So I'm gonna explain this a little bit. So this person, they're both playing Tetris, they're both doing okay, right? They haven't lost or anything. But along the way, you can tell they have these little holes in their design, right? And this is what happens when you start cutting things and then you don't go the extra step to say, okay, fine, we're cutting 80% of layer 5, we're cutting all of layer 5. Or we cut something in layer 4, we've already said that we don't need layer 5 if layer 4 is not there. So we have to be kind of on top of it and know that it's safe to get rid of those other things because we've already designed it that way. We know the game's gonna still survive and actually be better without those things, because now they're tangents, they're not integral to the experience. So a few big takeaways. So, yeah, what slide am I on? Okay, so you've done all this work, and the big thing now is just auditing your game that you're making as often as possible, right? And this takes a little bit of discipline, but it's something you should just lean on your producer for, whenever possible. But it's something you want to do regularly. So Whether it's, okay, we're doing 4-week sprints, so at the end of each sprint, we're going to look back at our design and kind of see where we're tracking, or at major production builds, or before E3, or whatever it is, but you do it regularly so that you can kind of take stock of your overall vision, your overall game, and make sure that everything's still locking in place. You don't have any of those dangling pieces of the design that are breaking your continuum, and make sure that you don't need to de-scope. These are your moments where you can look at your design and say, honestly to yourself, are we going to succeed? Are we going to make it? I think we are. And then you just look at each other and, fist bump and march forward. So I know that there's no one solution that works for every game, right? We're all working on things of different scale. Sometimes our timelines are really tight and we're already down to that base shippable version when we start, right? But in general, I think this approach works incredibly well for the types of games a lot of us are all working on now, right? We're all working, or a lot of us in the industry are working on live games, or these games as a service games, these games that have repeated updates forever and ever into the future, and you're going to be working on them for a long time. And the worst thing that can possibly happen in these games, because I've done this multiple times, is that you're so laser focused on the thing right in front of you, right? Like the next update. And all of your eggs are in that one update basket, and the whole team is so focused that you're losing sight of whatever's coming next. And then you ship that thing, and the community's like, bravo, you did it, congratulations. However, when is the next update, like next month or 2 months from now? Because we want that right now. And then you look at each other and you're like, I have no plans, I have no idea what we're gonna do next. With this layered design approach, you're only one update away from hitting that next layer, right? You can always add in those missing elements and over time achieve that initial vision, right? If we were going to continue driving home on this update, we could continue expanding it out and hit that evasion plan. So in the beginning, I talked about, that massive stat they really like, the 20 million players. I think to Red Storm and to all the developers that pitched in on year 2 of the division, this is kind of the stat that we like the most. So it says, for the 3 months after 1.8 shipped, players were spending on average 3 hours a day in New York City, which was way more than we'd seen before. And overall, engagement with the entire community, everyone who had ever played the game, the lapsed players, hardcore players, was up over 2 times. So there were a lot more people looking at the game, and they were really happy with the game. The overall sentiment had never been higher. And that's not something I say braggadociously or anything, it's just to point out that I've kind of laid out to you all the difficult little design choices that we made that didn't let me achieve that initial vision I had, that really cool thing that I really wanted to make. But with this approach, and scaling back, and being smart, we still shipped something that didn't just achieve our goals, it exceeded most of our goals, right? And the community was really happy. But we're not working on that game anymore. Now we're working on the Division 2, and we have a bunch of open hires, and you guys should go to our job page if you're interested, and you can come work with us and see how, full of shit I am. Any questions?
What's going on within those layers? I guess it's not just you came up with an idea state and then it's fallen at right and you just go, let that implement. There should be some kind of iterations on the idea, like you should do some, I assume you might do some risk assessment, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Whether that would work. Like, can you go and explain how that works with them?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely don't on day one sit down and plot out the entire layer structure. And I hit on this a little bit, but for me, it's definitely something that I'm doing kind of internally on top of the designs we're making, right? It's something that I try to build into the designs and into the overall thing we're going to ship. So we're still doing tons of design iteration on each little piece of that puzzle, right? A lot of time went into, say, that simulation of the open world. And a designer was attached to that, and they were making it, making a full system on that could be implemented, and little tweaks were being made. And then those go through an approval process. So basically what we do is, in the beginning, it's a lot of me working with individual designers and maybe a paired programmer just to kind of make sure we're not too crazy. And then it'll go through a full approval with like producer, making sure it's somewhat in scope. But with this kind of general approach, we'll spend a little time on designs that are one layer deeper or 2 layers deeper in preparation.
So, and the result of that is a prototype. It's not like some shippable part of the game.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time it's paper, right? We do a lot of stuff on paper. We don't jump right in and start prototyping. And when we do that type of stuff, we'll typically only do in-engine prototypes before something is kind of at least partially approved. When it's like a twist on something we already have, right? When it's something that like a tech designer and a tech artist can kind of kit bash together to get the idea across, we do that a lot. But when it's going to take like engineering effort and pull people away from things that are approved and are already getting worked on, we'll kind of iterate on paper. Yep. Any other questions? Hi.
You were mentioning about like the end game getting cut, or like there was a whole lot of end game. Was that? I know you said you started like almost when it shipped, but like for the Division 2, are they going to look into like having more end game like up front, or because I noticed like a lot of them like MMOs that come out, they don't really focus on end game very much. They have the core game, which is fun, but when you hit end game, there's like not really much there.
Yeah, we're not talking too much about it yet, but I would say like we learned a lot of lessons the first time around.
You started to talk about this a bit at the end about what happens after some update gets pushed and then you're looking at towards the future with layers. What are some strategies that you use for preserving layers that were not sort of met by a ship date, and then merging those layers into the new directions? Like, what sort of like merging and preserving happens with the layers that weren't reached when you're moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we'll do a lot of the time is basically we'll have these designs, we'll have this overall vision that we're tracking towards, and then, you know, like we said, we'll hit some cutoff point where we're not going to go deeper on the design than this right now. And typically, right, there could be one element that's kind of off on the side that isn't connected to the full game, and so we'll do evaluations on, like, is there one piece over here that, you know, will help the PvP experience go one level deeper, but not necessarily change the resistance experience. So, you know, we're kind of doing this approach across the entire game, so prototyping multiple game modes for PvP simultaneously, and then scaling back to the one we think is most ready, and then saving those other ones for future updates. Yeah.
So, you have a similar approach to what we are talking about, but we are experiencing a lot of additional effort to put in one stage to finalize the quality that you can really ship it.
Yeah.
And then if you decide to go to the next stage, then you have to have wasted some of your time. How do you cope with that?
So one thing we do is we'll do an additional document after like the core design is kind of locked down and like one whole layer is kind of like formed. We'll do a document that we call like a FSO, and it stands for something, feature sign-off document. And basically, we take that design and we break it into different stages. So like things we know we want to hit to say this is prototype, things that we want to hit to make sure this is like alpha quality. So what we do is we make sure we don't go full-on beta shippable quality on anything, right? Like once we hit the subset of goals that kind of prove the design out and we're confident that we're going to have the time later to come back, we'll move on to the next thing.
Do you guys ever grab ideas from the community, like Reddit, that are just like putting out, you know, like, oh, it'd be cool if...
Oh yeah, like a lot of the time. So, I mean, I don't know if there was much overlap with the talk this morning about the vision, but they talked about the ETF, the Elite Task Force. So one thing we've done is we have this group of players who is super invested in the game, and we'll bring them out for focus groups. But one thing we didn't talk about this morning is that's a maintained relationship. So I have a special forum that I'll go on with them, and they can post whatever they want. And then we'll have like representatives from, say, like Reddit or something people will like culminate ideas, and those will kind of get pushed up. Plus, we're on Reddit constantly, like all of us. And so, kind of pushing that even forward, we'll set up kind of somewhat regular calls where we just kind of check in and see how the community is doing, and if there's any like really big hot button things they want us to hit on. So, like for instance, one thing that changed a lot in year 2 was the reward plan for those global events that what I talked about, the timed events, right? We had it out on the test server and no one was happy with it, and the actual ideas for the real economy and how often people needed to get rewarded and all those type of things came kind of directly from the community's feedback.
You talked about a little bit the layer designs, like layer 1's the base essentials and things, but when it comes to like the second layer and following, you add the new features. Have you ever gotten to a point, and how did you deal with it, with adding a new feature mechanic that was designed or expanded too large? Like, did it ever accompany more than one layer? Did you get back, only present one layer of it and work on the second layer part?
That's a really, really good question. I mean, one of those definitely is we also added a whole new tier of gear for year 2, and there was a lot of stuff we were planning, and one of them was we had these classified sets that were kind of like we took a lot of gear from the first year and modified it and made it like more rare, kind of like exotic stuff from other looter shooters, and we had a very scaled back layer 1 of that, which was just give you more flexibility on kind of min-maxing the item and more stat recalibration. And then we had 5-tier perks and 6-tier perks, and then there was visual modifications that would go on them, and that design went really deep. And we did definitely, as we were kind of developing that, like dip our toes into deeper layers of that design and have to pull it back because we got overscoped, right? Like we ended up settling on the stat recalibration and new stats and some material swaps on existing items, but the plans went broader at certain points.
How do you decide when you have that kind of like backlog of layers, if it's something that you put in a later update for your current title, or if it should be pushed back to like the next time?
Well, for us, it was like how many more updates are we going to be involved in, right? Like there's definitely a thing where, as we're working on Division 2, right? And there was still plenty of people who would have been happy to keep going, right? Because we all have more things we wanted to do on the first game. So at some point it gets taken away, right? It's I think that like Miyamoto quote about like, you never died. I'm gonna say it wrong. He's smarter than me. But basically like games are taken away from you. Yeah. Not sure how much more time I have or how long I went even. Oh, we're getting close. I went almost the right amount of time. That's good. Any final questions? All right. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.